Hello and good evening. Very happy to welcome you for this very exceptional event. I'm glad to welcome the friends who've joined us at the Fondation Universitaire in Brussels, but also the many hundreds of viewers who watch us online. And this is a very special event, as I said, which is organized within the framework of a flagship project that our think tank CERRE has been working on for already more than 1.5 years, and which is called Global Governance for the Digital Ecosystems. The background of the project is the development of digital regulation since the early days of the internet in the mid-90s. Some of you will remember that at the time, there was no question of public intervention, of regulation of the internet. That was the time when the libertarian John Perry Barlow would publish his declaration on the independence of the cyberspace. And of course, since the mid-90s, things have changed. And have changed, and across the world, for good, and sometimes less good reasons, states have decided to take back control and regulate. And as you know, regulation is very much driven by a mix of economic interests, but also by values. And the values are the collective choices that a group of people, can be a club, can be a region, can be a country, can be a continent, can be a large part of the world, that they share, choices that they made. And of course, it's inevitable then that when you talk about choices made about regulating the digital ecosystem, well, there are divergences. And you can see, and even more recently, we see that the divergences become more acute, not least at a time where there is a major US-China tech decoupling. So the questions that we were asking ourselves with this project was, how can we avoid a fragmentation of the internet while retaining the benefits of course, an open, though appropriately regulated digital space, and not throw the baby with the bathwater. And so we came up with a focus for a project, which was also the subtitle of the first report of the project, which is preserving regulatory convergence and organizing coexistence when convergence is not feasible. And to answer that, our think tank gathered some 30 researchers, 30 top-level academics from not only all academic staff, the CERRE academic staff in Europe, but also great scholars from the US, from China, from Brazil, etc. And we asked them to analyze regulatory developments in their respective region on platform regulation, on data, on resilience of infrastructure, and on digital trade. And the report which came up for that first phase was published last November, and we presented it and discussed it with President Macron. This is the baby. It's as you can see, it's a 200+ page report. Please, sir. Of course, that report there is a 1-page and a 12-page executive summary also. So the report includes 50+ specific recommendations for each work streams, but also one overarching one. And that overarching recommendation is to the G20 to set up a global digital board. And that would be a forum which would be inclusive, which would be multi-stakeholder, which would include not only governments, but also regulatory agencies, industry, and civil society, And the remit of that forum would be to identify issues where convergence seems complicated and come up with recommendations on how to make a coexistence feasible. We went with this report already in different places in the world. We went to Washington. Of course, we are presenting it to a number of people in here in the institutions. And we went also to India. And of course, India is chairing for the moment this year the G20. And we seem to receive quite a positive reception from the Indian governments. We discussed with the G20 Sherpa, and India is most likely going to incubate the idea in the G20 process. And phase 2 of the project is now kicking off very soon with the support of a number of global organizations which are members of CERRE, and of course in complement to the work of other instances such as the OECD, UNESCO, the UN, who are working very often on part of what is the global agenda. So this evening we'll be talking with our guests about many hot topics, ranging from Europe's lead in digital regulation to the role of digital regulation in global governance, and also, of course, the future of multilateralism in the currently rather complex and difficult geopolitical situation. So to address these issues, I'm very pleased to welcome tonight 3 senior figures from international politics and industry. Josep Borrell Fontelles, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission. Karen Melchior, member of the European Parliament, Danish, and coordinator for Renew Europe in the Legal Affairs Committee, the URI Committee. Karen's, if you're not aware, your focus, if I'm right, is digital and consumer rights protection in relations to platforms and AI. So I think you were perfectly, we're very happy to have you to discuss these issues. And our third guest comes all the way from San Diego, California for this event. And he's Alex Rogers, the President, Global Affairs and Technology Licensing for Qualcomm. So thank you very much to all 3 of you. If you bear with me just for 1 minute before we start on logistics, we are not only live streaming, but we are also live tweeting. And the official hashtag for this discussion on Twitter is #CERREGlobal. And our account to follow is @CERRE_think tank. And finally, we'll also try, if time allows, to take a few questions from the audience. And for those who watch us online, you can put your questions via the Q&A device, the Q&A button on your Zoom software. So let's start immediately with Josep Borrell. Europe has been a prime mover in digital regulation and in more widely in regulating regulatory frameworks in the digital sphere. We have the GDPR, we have the DMA, the DSA, the AI, etc., etc. So can we launch this discussion by asking you what are the values which you see driving the union's regulatory efforts, but also the values which contribute to our leadership in that area?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I am not an expert on regulation, but I am very much aware of the importance of the global governance of the digitalization. This is uncharted territories. And we have a special envoy for specifically this issue, digital diplomacy. What is digital diplomacy, and which are the objectives that we want to look? I think that we have to add a 4-pillar to what Europe represents. We represent political freedom, we represent economic prosperity, and we represent social cohesion. Well, let's add the fourth pillar, which is our digital model of society. And we have to incorporate privacy as a right of the citizens, which until now was not considered so important. And we have to insist on the idea that human rights and democracy have to survive in the digital world. I'm saying that because look, for example, one figure. Global internet freedom has declined this year for the 15th year in a row. Yes, 4 billion people have access to internet, but 75% of them lack freedom of expression. Yes, they have access to internet, but they can't say what they would like to say. And from the point of view of interference on the democratic process, on the last 10 years, 1.7 billion voted in 41 elections and referenda that suffered from interference, mainly from Russia. Russia has attacked using digital tools 31 elections and 7 referenda in 26 different countries around the world. Half of these countries were here in the European Union. So just imagine how important it is to work on the governance of this phenomena. For me, this is one of the most important foreign and security policies. How do we manage? How do we bring security? How do we control our democratic processes? And the way in which the world will manage to solve it will define the kind of societies in which we are going to live. Who will control that? It's going to be the big firms. It's going to be the state, like in China, or it's going to be the corporations, the ultra-liberal model, or it's going to be the society, the European model. And that's why I am so interested in this book. And that's why I'm thank you for inviting me. I'm sure I will learn a lot from my co-tertulianos. How do you say co-tertulianos?
Co-speakers.
Co-speakers. More than speakers, huh? It's
co-participants, but I'm sure they're more
better
Hispanophiles than anyway. So
the figures are impressive. Huh?
Sorry,
these figures are
of course
impressive.
Let me build on that and ask Karen Melchior. You've been at the forefront on the fight for values in the discussion on tech regulation in Europe. So how could we protect our European values offline, online? And how can we have the figures that the Vice President just mentioned? How can we improve those figures?
I think it's important to look at it not just as European values, but as fundamental rights and fundamental values for all global citizens as well as European citizens. Often we see that values are being used as an excuse for protectionism and for trying to close off markets against competitors or producers of technologies in other countries. And we also see that these values are nice to talk about in speeches to big conferences and not actually then implemented in the regulation that we have. I think rather than talking about sort of undefined values that we may end up disagreeing on, I think openness and transparency, privacy and accountability are what forms our values, what forms our possibility as consumers and as citizens to hold our governments and politicians accountable. We talked about the sort of golden era and the start of the internet and digitalization as being sort of libertarianism, but it was also developed into a possibility of opening up hierarchical organizations and governments for the citizens to have their voice. And it actually helped Arab populations and North African populations to bring down dictators that had ruled them for decades. But what we're seeing now is that these countries that didn't think that the internet was something that needed to take seriously, they're now using it to suppress their own populations. And from a regulatory values-based point of view within Europe, we also thought that it was enough with codes of conduct and sort of not mandatory, but sort of voluntary advice to companies, and that this was sufficient to keep them on the straight and narrow and protect security and privacy of citizens and consumers, and for them to be open and transparent. But we've seen in recent elections in Turkey that politicians opposing Erdogan in the presidential elections, they were not allowed to access through digital means, their voters. They were being shut down by Turkish government authorities for whatever excuses. But that meant that we now, through the digital tools that we thought were going to give us more democracy and more openness and more of a voice to citizens, that it is actually being used to shut down the freedom of expression. And we also see a company like Twitter stepping away from the voluntary code of conduct and no longer respecting what will become European legislation next year. So it really underlines that the openness, transparency, privacy, and accountability is what is crucial in order to uphold our values. But we also, in the last year or year and a half, have seen suggestions, proposals from the Commission undermining something as crucial as encryption in order to, you would say, quote unquote, to save the children against child sexual abuse online. And here, I think it's important that we keep to our values of ensuring privacy of all citizens, both children and adults, and that this is something that is fundamental and should not be undermined also within what we legislate as European institutions.
We'll come back to the issues you just mentioned. I want to revert to Josep Borrell. As we are talking, the US and the EU are meeting in Luleå in Sweden for the two-day session of the Trade and the Technology Council. What do you expect from these discussions?
Well, I expect better coordination. I expect better coordination because when the US announced the Inflation Reduction Act, it was without a previous comment with us. And certainly this Inflation Reduction Act has important consequences for the competitivity of our firms. It's something that brings a lot of resources, much more than expected, to the US firms working on the field of renewables. It's certainly a good thing to fight against climate change because it pushes the development of renewables, but it creates competitivity problems with us. So it's clear that on technology and trade, the two big powers of the Western world has to coordinate better their efforts, their rules, and our role on the world stage. So this has been created for putting on the table, how do we create an ecosystem where technology, which is the driving force, will be related with our capacity to compete, providing technologies to others, and also looking at how we can control the, let's say, this word, which is very much fashionable today, de-risking, no? To avoid that the technological development, uncontrolled technological trade can create a risk for us. This requires a strong coordination between the two.
Alex, do you agree? Alex Rogers, you from a US perspective, a US industry perspective, what do you expect from the discussions in Luleå?
So this channel of communication, I think, is very valuable, but it doesn't have a lot of scale. It's very high level, but a very narrow channel of communication. We think it's essential. There are key topics there that have to be discussed: coordination on technology, coordination on essentially the allocation of technology, and how you're going to look at the world markets. Really important. Even the topic of standards, which is also within the TTC, very important to really get aligned on the topic of standards. There are a lot of serious issues that face us over the next decade or so on the topic of standards. So we're actually big proponents of this. From an industry perspective, we have found it probably maybe a little bit difficult to really inject our views in the dialogue, which is understandable in one sense, in that everybody wants to inject their views in the dialogue. But we found ourselves kind of reacting sometimes to things that have happened, after the fact, trying to be as constructive as possible. But I completely agree. There are things that occur in the US, IRA, there are things that occur here in Europe, DMA, where initially there are tensions. But with the right kind of dialogue, I think that those tensions can be overcome. And we can have a meeting of the minds on some of the regulation that needs to occur. One of the things that CERRE has completely right is that we have to find convergence and coexistence on regulation of the digital world.
Please.
What an American accent you have.
Accent? So I'm glad you said an American accent, because I actually am from New Jersey. And if I have a New Jersey accent, that's really bad. It's the third worst.
It was Californian accent.
No, it's the third worst accent in America. I won't tell you what the first two are.
Can we, I mean, despite these divergences between the accents, can we come back to perhaps one topic which is not officially on the agenda in Lulea, but which is, I would say, which is there, and that is China. How do you see, can there be a consensus between the EU and the US on China, and in particular in this area of the digital ecosystem, but more widely? I don't know who wants to take this first.
Which is the question exactly?
How can the US and the EU, can the EU and the US achieve a consensus on China?
I can try and start. I think we need to look at the reaction from the US when we started looking at the DSA and the DMA, where the US said, well, it's a European attack on American companies. And when we now have the finished pieces of legislation, it is much more balanced, and the worries that were across the Atlantic have somewhat been put to rest. So if we, from a US-European point of view, think about having regulation, having de-risking our infrastructure, our supply chains, then try and make sure that we have it on a factual, testable, transparent, open criteria, so that we cannot be attacked for saying this is only something that we're doing to avoid Chinese companies and Chinese influence. We need to make sure that we find a common position, both US and the EU, regarding not only China, but also, for example, Brazil and India, developments there. And there, I think it's important that we have a discussion across the Atlantic, but that we also, as suggested by CERRE, is one of having this global digital board, so that we include the rest of the world. Because looking at developments in the UN regarding Ukraine, we see sometimes that we need to bring the rest of the globe with us if we want to defend our values at a global scale and not just within Europe.
I think that's important. We have to work with like-minded countries, but to work with like-minded countries alone will not be enough. We have to build a geometry of partnerships, promoting our fundamental values and our standards, but creating closer links between us, the US certainly, and many others around the globe. I think it would be a mistake to consider that it's going to be the holy alliance of the US and Europeans in order to face China, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. The rest of the world exists, and they are looking at us, and they want to be part of it. And some of these rest of the world are or will become also superpowers from the point of view of the digital development. So we don't have to look at a triangle, China, US, EU, without taking into account how the others understand the problem.
This is, of course, a very important point. I've been struck by the fact that in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was the vote, the resolution condemning, and even in 2023, 1 year later, when there was again another vote at the Security Council, people were saying, we're very happy to mention that there were 140 countries who voted in favor of the resolution and just 5, 6, or 7 against. But what struck me, and struck, I suppose, many observers, is the fact that there were some 35 in February 22 and 32 countries still 1 year later who abstained. And I'm not talking about China, but I'm talking exactly as you said, Vice President, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. And when we take all these countries together, there are more than 2 billion people on this planet. So how can we get them in, and how can we get them in this discussion on digital issues? Perhaps Alex.
So actually, let me use the DMA as a vehicle for answering that question and just drill down a little bit, maybe to the mundane on the DMA. So as an American consumer, and this goes to this question of, does America see the DMA as being anti-American? As an American consumer, I walk into a carrier, a Verizon, and I say, I want to buy a new phone. And the salesperson will say to me, let me see your phone. And then he'll look at my phone and he'll say, you have this phone. It has this operating system. I'll sell you one of those. And I say, no, 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 I want the other phone with the other operating system. And he says, well, you don't really want that. And why don't they want to do that? Because there's no portability. It's so difficult. To make a sale from one operating system to another operating system is going to take 45 minutes. Whereas if you stick with the same operating system, it'll take 5 minutes. And so as an American consumer, I'm being deprived of my ability to make choice and move from one system to another with my own data. And then when I have a group chat with my family, I have a small family. We only have 3 kids. When I have a group chat with my family and one has an Android phone and the rest have Apple phones, we can't do it because the messaging degrades the Android participant. And so there are other basic issues that the DMA handles. And so as people around the world, in the US and every other place in the world, look at the DMA, they see a laundry list of things that the DMA, at least in the mobile digital world, the DMA is going to handle and say, oh, I'm going to make this better. I'm going to make this better. I'm going to make this better. They're going to make it better for consumers everywhere. They're going to make it better for innovators in the mobile space everywhere. It's really important, actually. And so you look at the US, and there are certainly people in the US that want to pass DMA-like legislation. Politically, very difficult to do. In Japan, they're looking at it because they want to pass DMA-like legislation in Japan. And I think that they actually will do it. In Brazil, there's another possibility there as well. In India, it's really interesting because India is essentially developing a mobile digital life for 1.3, 1.4 billion people that is essentially, that mitigates the creation of gatekeepers. Because the Indian government has created software platforms with APIs that others can basically build to. So there's a software platform by which everybody can have an identity. Everybody can have an identity. All you need is a cell phone in your hand. And then everybody can have a payment system, unified payment interface. And everybody can use that payment system. Even if you just sell fruit on the corner, you can use that payment system to actually transact with anybody. They're developing a larger platform that will allow you, through one platform, to basically buy from any market you want, any app store you want. It doesn't have to be controlled by a particular big gatekeeper. It can be anybody. And that app will give you that flexibility. So what you see in the DMA, from my perspective, is essentially a universal set of improvements to open the digital world in the mobile space. And so it really touches on both of these topics. And so what Europe is creating is not regulation that essentially, from our perspective, is oppressive of industry, particularly industry from one particular region. What Europe is creating is essentially an opportunity to create more choice, better environment for consumers, better environment for innovators. And it's adaptable everywhere. Everybody's interested in the exact same things.
You talk about API.
That's very
Sure.
interesting what you're saying.
It is, absolutely. But you're raising indirectly the issue of standardization, because when you talk about APIs and you talk about the Indian experience, standards are essential in this conversation. So how can we ensure that standards remain global? The Europe and the US have enjoyed a leadership in that area for many time, and we know that this is, for the moment, that's the least one can say, this is being threatened. So how do you think we can move towards a situation where we would be able to retain 6G is coming now, global standards?
Okay, so at the risk of talking too much, okay. So there are two parts to that question. The first part is, how do we maintain global standards? And I'm just going to talk from the cellular space. And then the second part is, well, with respect to the US and Europe, how do we maintain leadership? And the first part of the question, I think, is actually pretty simple. Pretty much everybody wants global standards in cellular, okay? Because that scale creates really tremendous opportunity and tremendous cohesion in the mobile world. And there have been a couple of efforts in the past to kind of splinter national standards. They've always failed, okay? It's technologically not very good, actually. It creates inefficiencies, it creates costs. So those have failed, and everybody's back on board with the idea of, hey, let's keep standards in the mobile space global. Okay, leadership, different question, different answer. And you're not going to like it. So in terms of leadership, leadership requires scale. And leadership in mobile standards also requires that you participate in, this is used too often, a virtuous cycle. So it starts with significant R&D leading up to standards. That is significant R&D in how you design the technology that enables cellular systems. And then you have to participate in standards. How do you get your technology into the standard and adopted by the industry because it has merit, okay? And then there's implementation and deployment. And implementation and deployment at scale is very important for maintaining a leadership role, because implementation and deployment allows you to take your standards, your technology, and put it into the system, and the other participants in the industry understand that you know how to do it. You'll be able to make the standards work, but it also helps you basically become immersed in the industry, in all of the operations around the world, so that you can then go back to the table and continue the virtuous cycle of R&D, because you know what to do next, right? And so from different perspectives, from a silicon perspective, you have to have scale and you have to have speed. So Qualcomm, I'm not going to talk about Qualcomm, but we have scale and we have speed, okay? But in addition to that, you have to be able to deploy the technology. And actually, Vice President, you said something recently that is very, very true. In order to lead in the standards of tomorrow, you have to lead in the technology development of today. Absolutely true. And so one of the problems that's happening in Europe in terms of deployment is that the carriers are highly fragmented, okay? And this is a real problem. So if you look at around the world, different carriers that have more than 500,000 subscribers. In China, you have 3 carriers, tremendous scale. In the US, you have 7 carriers, tremendous scale. In Japan, you have 4 carriers, tremendous scale. Okay, so that scale is good for them, okay? In Europe, you have 38 carriers that have 500 subscribers or more. So they're lacking scale, okay? The other problem, if you look at it, is that in 4G deployment, okay, the mobile digital world was created on the back of 4G deployment, 4G innovation and 4G deployment. In the first 5 years of 4G deployment, basically Europe and the US led not only in developing the technology and developing the standards, but also deployment. And then basically on top of that, innovation took place. All the innovation that you all know, food service and Uber and all this stuff. In 5G, look at 5G 5 years out. Europe, about 90,000 base stations deployed, maybe a little bit less. Japan, 110,000. US, 220,000 5G base stations. South Korea, 300,000 5G base stations. China, 2.5 million. India, who just started deploying 5G this year, 150,000 already, and they're going to skyrocket, well past that. And so in other regions, there's tremendous scale. And in Europe, 5G deployment is actually flagging, falling behind, and it's a platform for further innovation. So that platform is actually not where it needs to be. And so what do you have to do? You have to change this. So if you want to lead in 6G, but you don't have scale, you don't have effective deployment as a region, you're going to find it very, very difficult to lead in 6G. You need scale to have gravitas. And so I understand that there's a debate between OTT, over the top, fair share, and net neutrality. I understand that. But a solution has to be found. And so you asked the question, leadership. And what I'm saying is that leadership is tied to this issue. So you can't anticipate or expect to lead in 6G if you're in the current situation you are in now and you don't solve that problem. Sorry, that was too long.
No, it was not too long. And thank you for remembering my sentence that
In Munich. It was in Munich.
I don't remember when, but it's something in which I strongly believe. We have been the standard setters because we were at the forefront of the technological development. If you are not longer there, you will not fix the standards of the future. And the famous Brussels effect is no longer enough. Because at the end, the ones who fix the standards is like el árbitro. How do you say the one that in the football? Yeah? And the referee doesn't make goals. Huh? The referee is not winning the party. So if you want to win the party, you should pretend to be something more than just a referee. You have to be a player and to be ready to attack. So we should not be happy by being the referee, because the referee doesn't win the games. And at that moment, we are not winning the games. If we have a look at the 40 technological companies by country, worldwide, at market capitalization, when I have a look at that, I see that among the 10 biggest one, 7 are from USA. No one is from Europe. And if I have a look at the second rank, the following 10, there is one European, Netherlands. And you look at the 40, you see that it is US, it is China, it is Japan, and then Europe is lagging behind. So this is something that we have to take very much into consideration when we talk about being a geopolitical player and taking into account the transformation role of the digital transition, because it's going to affect our role in the world. And on the same way that we are saying we cannot be a military power without a strong defense industry, you cannot be a geopolitical player without a strong digital capacity. And by the time being, we are not having it. So I hope that this book will be a wake-up call.
I hope so, but with your support, I'm sure it will.
Well, that's what I'm doing here.
Absolutely. Karen, Melchior, we obviously, the referee is not necessarily the leader, but if the referee is contributing to set the standards, clearly it provides him or her with an advantage. If we take the example of AI, and of course, everybody talks now about the generative AI, regulating AI is becoming a pressing priority. And we've seen it at the G7. I suppose that in Luleå, they're going to talk about that, or they're talking about that too. So from your perspectives, what are the issues to be considered when we talk about regulating AI?
I think we are still a world leader in regulation, also on AI. And we're actually going to probably be the first region that has legislation on AI, whereas we've had a number of different forums for discussing governance of AI, the OECD, UNESCO, the Council of Europe. They've all had high-level expert groups. They've all had written policy papers. but it has not moved forward into legislation. And then you see the industry developing the tools and developing the different AI systems that are then suddenly busting on into the global scene, but nobody has actually taken into account what of the previous work on standards and ideas that had been developed. And there, I think it's important that we sort of distinguish between the standards and the regulation, where we're very good at the regulation also in the digital sphere in Europe. And we used to be very good on the standards, but that was because we used to have the majority of industry based in Europe. And therefore, our industrial companies, our industrial organizations, they were the ones that could say, okay, our way of doing things has merit, it has scale, and should be the global standard. And at the moment, we don't have the research and development investments. We don't have the universities that are developing the new technologies in Europe. And when they do, when they then choose to scale, they often go to the US in order to develop their company. So we also need to look at how do we finance our startups? How do we finance our industry so that we can make sure that the only way of developing as a digital company isn't to go and be exited and be bought by a US company and then move over there. And I think when looking at carriers in the sort of mobile sphere and telcos, and I think it's interesting to see what level of fragmentation or monopolies or duopolies that we should be allowing. I mean, Denmark is a very small country, but it has a large number of operators. They are using part of the same networks. I think there might be 2 or 3 networks there. So, I mean, there is some convergence, but I can, as a consumer, switch between different operators for my subscription. And we have 5G in most places, which I still haven't really seen that much here in Belgium, where you do not have that many operators open to consumers. So I think it's not just reducing the amount of carriers, but also making sure that the carriers are actually competing with each other to provide the best service and the highest level of connectivity to the consumers.
Yes, please.
On that last point, I completely agree. Look, I think in the semiconductor space, consolidation has to happen in a space with high fragmentation as we have here in Europe. I personally think consolidation is a good idea, but I completely agree that you have to respect consumer benefit. Otherwise, you're missing one of the purposes of trying to get this done, because you're trying to bring better services, better platform, essentially not just to individual consumers, but to businesses as well, because 5G is going to be a very important platform. So I completely agree with your statement there. On the AI, I'll just make one comment from the sideline as a citizen. I'm really rooting for you folks in government because what is capable, what we know now is capable of AI technology. Now that we're in the generative AI era, is really incredible, both in terms of the potential benefits, but also the potential detriments. And these large language models are out there. They're moving, they're running, they're being attached to apps as we speak right now. They're even being essentially modified through open source right now. And so those capabilities are actually pretty incredible and potentially tremendously beneficial, but potentially tremendously destructive. And so I think that there's an unusual consensus among industry and government now that we need to get a hold of this problem. But it's not good enough to get a hold of this problem in North America and in Europe. That's just not good enough. This is a worldwide problem. This is something that needs to be addressed on a global basis without any question. And it's going to be difficult. And so your theme of convergence, coexistence, or fragmentation is not a good option. Okay. Mm-hmm. Convergence is probably not possible, but coexistence has to happen. And so trying to convene globally to at least get to that point is really important.
There's one area that where progress in that direction has to take place, and this is in the area of foreign information manipulation and interference, Josep Borrell. We're going to have elections, major elections next year in Europe. We're going to have major elections in the United States. So we see that FIMI is a growing threat worldwide, and we see it, in fact, every day in action, for instance, in Ukraine today. So what's what is the EU doing, and what scope do you see for global action in that area?
Well, global action, I read in your paper the recommendation of a global digital board on a G20. And this is an interesting idea, but perhaps this idea has to be confronted with this paper that has been published a couple of days ago, a global digital compact coming from the United Nations for an open, free, and secure digital future for all. So your idea of the board and this policy brief in the United Nations makes me think about how do we build the new structures in order to improve the current, certainly imperfect world of digital institutions. Is the G20 the right place to place this board? I have my doubts. Because at that moment, the G20 is certainly not representing the full spectrum of political situation. No? So I think that we have to reread this contribution in the light of this global digital compact of the United Nations. But the problem of interference on elections, I can tell you, is going to be more and more and real issue for our democratic life. And the working of infrastructure that mislead, lie, destabilizes, erode the trust in institutions. At the end, information is the engine of democracy. Democracy works based on information. When you call citizens go and vote, they go and vote on the basis of the information they have about which are the alternatives, how to judge the government and how to judge the candidates. Information is more than ever the blood of democracy. And information can be so easily manipulated at an industrial scale. And they are doing that at the industrial scale. They are troll farms, which are dedicated to systematically bias the way people, the voters, perceive reality. And we have very good examples of that. And in my team at the External Action Service, we have created task forces, especially dedicated to different geographical areas in order to build resilience and address information manipulation. And we created a rapid alert system linking all member states with exchanges about what's going on, who is saying what on a daily basis. And we have the European Union versus Disinformation campaign that contributes to raise awareness about this phenomena of foreign manipulation and interference. And we are reaching nearly 20 million through social media accounts and websites of examples of direct interference. And if we believe that the citizens, when they go to vote, they do that as responsible beings which have an understanding of what is going on, we have to take care of the way they are being informed. When you go to the market and you buy a piece of meat, this piece of meat has been through a lot of controls, health controls, in order to avoid you to be poisoned by that, no? When you read some news, which are the controls? Your mind can be poisoned, maybe more easily than your body, but there is not such controls, the prophylactic controls. And this is a very sensitive issue, because where controls ends in order to ensure that the information you receive is good, and where censure starts in order to prevent you from knowing things. And I think that our societies has still not found the solution to this phenomenon, which is a very recent one, but is growing exponentially. And you will see in the next European elections, you will see how much interference will be. And I am sure that the ones who create interferences have more powerful and more able tools than the ones who have to prevent from interference. So we have to invest more on that.
I would like to come back on what you said about the G20 and the Global Digital Board, but perhaps still on this issue on foreign disinformation and manipulation. Karen Melchior, comments on that?
Manipulation has always existed. Manipulation of information is not the new phenomenon. What is new is the capacity of dissemination of the
exactly.
And also the amount of accounts that will promote certain points of views without us actually being able to understand who is behind the account. And that is part of what we're doing in the DSA, is saying we want to have transparency about who is paying for advertisement on the online platforms. We need to have possibility for complaining if our posts are being taken down, if our accounts are being taken down, so that we have transparency about why the decision was taken in the way that it was by the platforms. It's not that we wish from a European point of view, we want to make sure that the journalists and the citizens know why their posts are being taken down and that they have a right to appeal. It is the citizens and the national member states court systems that will decide what content is illegal or legal to post online. It's not within the DSA. And I think it's important that we have the approach that I believe that you have in the External Action Service, is looking at not only the content of the input from abroad, but what the objective of the communication and the input is. Is it in order to engage in a dialogue about a specific subject or developments of global affairs? Or is it trying to sabotage the democratic dialogue within Europe? And if it is trying to sabotage and manipulate in a destructive manner, then we need to respond to it. And I think the tools on having transparency and accountability will actually help us there. But I think we also need to be aware that it's not just foreign interference. It is also sort of homegrown interference and trying to distract from the democratic debate that we have, which will be problematic. Before the European elections next year, we will be having elections in Spain in July. So, and it will be quite interesting to try and see what kind of dialogue and debate there is there, because I mean, there are certain parties in Spain that have alliances with the Republicans in the US and Fidesz in Hungary, and also PiS in Poland. And there will probably be a convergence of messaging there. And it's also a question of how do we maintain a united European institutions communication on what it is that we're doing. Because, for example, this morning we were discussing recognition of parenthood. If you have a family where the child has two parents recognized in, for example, Germany or Greece, and they then move to Portugal or Poland, how does this child make sure that it has the right for its parents to make decisions if it has to be given consent when they're hospitalized in another EU member state? And the debate this morning was distorted into saying that the EU is trying to enforce accept of surrogacy in all member states. And this is a manipulation of what the Commission proposal actually is about. And I think we as EU institutions need to have clear communication about what it is that we're trying to regulate and what it is that we're doing, and have that clear communication. And hopefully also we will have journalists that will move away from being sort of addicted to the algorithms of our platforms and trying to look for where do we have conflicts, where do we have somebody saying something outrageous, and then having all of the media attention there, because I think that will be destructive interference in our democratic dialogue if we do not move away from what gets the most clicks, what gets the most comments, what is the most sort of provocative for looking at the substance. Sorry for being long.
Can I just, 30 seconds, it'll be really quick. So the current paradigm, as you just described, in terms of social media disinformation and the kind of the AI ingredient that is essentially attention AI or curating AI is extremely problematic. But then the future paradigm is a next level problematic. When you have generative AI creating disinformation and machines essentially are let loose to create disinformation, you just have a whole new level of problems. And so I hate to, offer up a problem without a solution, but it is really going to be, I think, quite impactful.
This is, I remember when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain, since we are talking about Spain, that I was already worried about that. It was 4 years ago. And I wanted to create a certain filter like the one that we have here, EU versus disinformation. I remember I was accused of willing to create the Ministry of Truth. Someone who says what is truth and what is not truth. A checking point, but someone has to check. Someone has to check. And there are some private organizations who check what the politician says in the electoral campaign. And especially when there is a debate, there are some private organizations and the following day says, yesterday it was said, well, it's not true, or it is half true. It has to be some checking, because if everybody can say whatever they want to say without a contrast, then where is the quality of the debate? But I understand it's a sensitive issue, but we cannot make, on ne peut pas faire l'économie de ça. On ne peut pas dire it's too difficult, let's look to the other side. It's very difficult, but it has to be faced.
We are entering the last part of this conversation. So I would like invite once again viewers and also, of course, the friends in the room to put questions. I received them on my smartphone, so don't think that I'm impolite while my friends are talking that I'm watching my iPhone. It's just to get to see the questions that are coming. So I don't know at this stage if there is any question in the room first. Yes, sir. Can we give him a mic, please?
Otherwise, the people online will not be able to hear you.
Otherwise, we will hear you here, but not in the live stream.
I think it works. So this is Carlos Rodriguez with Telefónica. Thank you very much for the fascinating conversation. And the question that was coming to mind to me is, it is very good to have this framework of cooperation for governance and for setting the policy framework in the digital space. But at the same time, how do you reconcile that with the, I would say, legitimate aspiration to develop your own capabilities in the digital space? So the quest for strategic autonomy and the idea of being competitive as well as setting the rules of the game, because we're seeing already some tensions when that happens, and that is creating between like-minded countries sometimes different approaches to that concept.
Who wants to take that?
I think it's going back to sort of the openness and transparency and accountability, and also the discussion that we had exchanged on the DMA. we need to make sure that there is a level playing field for companies, whether they're based in the EU or they're based in the US, so that we are actually able to have strategic autonomy without closing off Europe for the rest of the world. Because sometimes as a Dane, I feel like the discussion on strategic autonomy often seems a little bit protectionistic and closing off the European market from the rest of the world. I think we need to be not naive. We need to make sure that our partners across the world are actually following the rules that we've set up. I think the developments in WTO have been very problematic. We've had rules that are not being followed, and we don't have sanctions to actually make sure that they are upheld, or at least it takes 20 years. So we need to make sure that there is development and innovation in Europe as well as elsewhere. And I think having transparency and accountability and truly open markets and dialogue regarding how do we support our industries in times of economic crisis, both in the US, but also in Europe, so that we can see that it is a fair support based on who is providing the best products, rather than just trying to give to already existing industries in your home countries and regions.
There is one point that I'd like to come back on, High Representative, and this is the but we started a bit late, so that's why I want to give them 1 hour. Just on the global the G20, when Pascal Lamy and I came up with that idea, and we co-leading this project, or the idea is basically very much in line with what you said, is to engage in this discussion. And we're not talking about decision-making body. We're talking just as a body where we can have this kind of conversation, but to engage in these conversations, countries such as Brazil, India, South Africa, etc., because we cannot leave them outside, because leaving them outside will have major negative impact on global governance issues, which you are and the EU is very much concerned with. So that's basically the rationale behind the G20. I mean, that body within the G20, or reporting to the G20, but of course working in cooperation with all the other instances which are discussing these issues.
Look, next year we are going to have this global digital compact put on the table. And this global digital compact will shape the way in which the digital matters are being managed at the United Nations. And then will come the World Summit on Information Society. Will be a key rendezvous for taking stock of the global internet governance after 20 years. So we have to avoid fragmentation. If we fragment internet, then it's not longer internet. So the idea of going to two different technological ecosystems close to each other that represents a confrontation between China and the West, I think has to be avoided. And in order to avoid it, you have to be sure that the ones that you mentioned very clearly, which are at the end and will be more and more powerhouse for digital, are on board. So the question that this report puts on the table to me, together with the digital compact presented by the Secretary General of the United Nations, is do we have to support what we have, knowing that is very imperfect, or we take the risk of building new structures in a climate where cooperation within United Nations member states or within the G20 members are becoming increasingly difficult? That's what I feel. No, you call for cooperation at a moment when cooperation is missing more and more. So what do? We try to work, but what do we have? We know it's imperfect. but take care to build new structures based on the idea that the cooperation will be accepted as a rule of the game. When my personal perception as international player is that cooperation is vanishing. Confrontation is the key word today.
Perhaps a last question to conclude, and I will put it to the three of you. When we look at multilateralism today, clearly the geopolitical context is making it very different as a goal as it used to be just a few years ago. How do you see the multilateralism in this new geopolitical context, with the leadership race between China and the US, and with a world which is becoming more and more multipolar? So perhaps I will leave the last word to
I don't want to talk too long, too much. It's a paradox. The world is becoming more multipolar and much less multilateral. And it's a paradox because multilaterality needs multidimensionality. It's impossible to be multilateral with it is just one pole. So one could imagine that more poles requires more multilateralism. And it's happening just the contrary. The more poles, the less multilateralism.
Mhm.
It's probably also because the international institutions and organizations that we have were built for a less multipolar world. And the powers that were big when they were created, for example, the permanent members of the Security Council, they are not willing to give up the powers that they have in the existing organizations, which is necessary if we want to have a multilateral system that reflects the multipolar reality in which global diplomacy is today.
It's actually kind of a paradox when you look at the international dynamics. You guys are the experts on this, not me, but basically everybody is looking for everybody's support. Okay, so you have a division, and on either side of the lines, everybody's looking for everybody else's support. And so, again, I go back to your theme on convergence and coexistence. It actually resonates with something that Kissinger said. He was just recently interviewed by The Economist, and he said, look, we can agree on a bunch of things, but there are a couple of things where we just have to coexist so that we all survive. Okay, so it's really important that we just get to the point of agreeing on, we don't have to agree, but we just have to mutually coexist so that everybody can survive. And one of the things that I actually am optimistic about is, and I'm going to be very Eurocentric here, and this is not just, fawning on Europeans because I'm in Europe and not in San Diego, but you guys are actually really good at policy. And so you're actually really good about thinking about some of these problems in the digital world. And so I think it's actually quite a good thing, regardless of whether it's in the UN or the G20, that you're producing work product on how we can manage and how we can regulate and how we can try to come agreement across lines. And there's actually quite a significant audience for that. And I think it's important that you keep doing it because the alternative is not very, very good. So we'll see how it works out.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our three guests this evening. Clearly, this conversation is going on, and we are going to continue with this project, the Global Governance for the Digital Ecosystem, with the phase 2, and in many other conversations on the various subtopics, which of course make are part of the global issues. I'd like to thank everybody. You will be able to watch again this on our social medias and on the CERRE site, cerre.eu. And I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much. Sure.